We are living through a historic and decisive moment of calm before the storm. Climate change is not some distant possibility. It's already here. We feel it in our unbalanced seasons, have all heard about it on television, and know that it will not be stopped unless something changes. Well, awareness campaigns were a good first step. Making sure people knew about the issue was effective and essential. Targeting children in schools, teaching them about greenhouse gases, the acidification of the ocean, and the sixth mass extinction was a particularly important component. After all, if you want to convince the adults, teach the children, and they'll do the convincing for you. But we also had a focus on individual action. Instead of advertising the need for global, systemic change, discussions centered around the question that was all the rage. What should you do to help stop climate change? Well, that hasn't worked very well, has it? While reduce, reuse, recycle may make for a catchy slogan, we have, in our quality of citizens and democratic systems, a tool with far more power than any change in lifestyle. We have the right to vote. Now consider a high school where a given student decides to try out vegetarianism. Although it's true that such a diet can lower a person's individual emissions relating to food by up to 50%, at the end of the day, that won't make a dent in the total carbon footprint of their class or of the school. How much more impactful would it be if the administration were to create a weekly no-meat day where each and every student was made to discover an alternative way of eating and showcase their willingness to act upon the value of ecological responsibility? Offloading that responsibility onto individuals is not the answer. Institutions and centers of authority have a far greater potential for impact than any single person could alone. And I think most of us would agree that this is their role. While a booming and prosperous economy may only require a bare minimum of government involvement, when the nation is in crisis, as was the case during the Great Depression, the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course the climate crisis, the need for government intervention is clearer than ever. It is the government that sets the standard when economics fails to do so, and when moral, social, and diplomatic considerations need to factor into the equation on top of profit. Over a decade ago, Massachusetts became one of the first US states to adopt a comprehensive regulatory program to address climate change. The Global Warming Solutions Act, a piece of legislation dating back to 2008, set ambitious goals for the state's ecological transition, stating that the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs must achieve a 10 to 25% reduction of statewide emissions by 2020. The Act outlined plans for radical reforms and regulations of the energy marketplace, the regular monitoring and analysis of carbon emissions, and the establishment of 2 advisory bodies to make informed recommendations. And their efforts were fruitful. In June of 2022, the state certified compliance with its 2020 goal with an estimated emissions reduction of 31.4% below 1990 levels. This dramatic improvement shows us the progress that can be made by institutions with the means and the capability of enacting change on this scale. And since 2008, the pace hasn't slowed either, with specific objectives being developed for the 2025, 2030, and 2050 thresholds. Now, interestingly enough, the data seems to indicate that this hasn't had a significant impact on the state's economic growth. On the contrary, Massachusetts has experienced remarkable growth since the 1990s, and yet has still managed to reduce its carbon emissions without affecting business, a risk that is so often cited as a counterargument to meaningfully addressing emissions. So what the example of Massachusetts shows us is the importance of reducing the emissions themselves, of course, but more importantly, of lowering the production of greenhouse gases per domestic product, so as to conserve and foster economic growth, while creating an economy in compliance with the restrictions necessary to fight climate change. Now, on the national level, of undeniable importance is the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, presented as an amendment to Biden's Build Back Better plan for economic reconstruction after the COVID-19 pandemic, the likes of the New Deal. This landmark piece of legislation represents the largest investment in climate change mitigation in the history of the United States. Of the $891 billion of authorized spending, $783 billion will be invested in projects related to domestic energy security and climate change, with tax credits, loans, and grants aiming to decarbonize the economy while stimulating American manufacturing, as this act is also a significant shift away from globalization and the offshoring of production and towards bringing geopolitically key industries to the United States, embracing the reality of the climate crisis in an attempt to redefine the mechanisms that govern the economy. Because unfortunately, given the current circumstances, corporations cannot be left to their own devices. Now, if we are to trust the projections made for this law, it truly stands to leave its mark on history. According to the World Economic Forum, the IRA will prevent the national debt from growing by $1.9 trillion over the next 20 years. And the Energy Innovation Group, a nonpartisan energy and climate think tank, estimates that the act will create 1.4 to 1.5 million new jobs and increase the US GDP by 0.84 to 9.88% by 2030. Not only is this impressive from an economic standpoint, according to the EPA, the US Environmental Protection Agency, the Inflation Reduction Act will lower economy-wide CO2 emissions, including electricity generation and use, by 35 to 43%, below 2005 levels by 2030. Now let me say that again. It is projected that this act will lower the carbon emissions of the United States of America, one of the largest economic forces in the world and a nation responsible for 12.6% of humanity's carbon footprint, by 35 to 43% by 2030. When I heard that for the first time, I have to say, I couldn't believe it. And when I told my friends, they couldn't believe it either. Because we grew up in a world that seemed to constantly be at war with itself. We thought, how could we let this happen? If our house is on fire, how could we be so neglectful as to turn a blind eye and let it burn? Well, generally, this is where the speaker would insert some call to action to today's adults, begging them to fix the problem before it's too late. But I won't do that either because, frankly, that's never worked. The thing is, we don't have the time for generational finger-pointing anymore. Rather, we need to come together. Because young people are not irrational beings, and we see what's going on. Instead of spending your time trying to dissect the psychology of Gen Z, listen and watch. There is strength in numbers, and if we can learn to respect each other, to share our thoughts and experiences on an equal footing, and to find a common need for change despite our differences, then maybe, just maybe, we can give hope to the hopeless generation. But of course, that's why I'm here today, to show my peers that our future may not be so grim. Governments hold immense power, and the means to push for change, our ability to participate in our country's politics, to hold our leaders accountable for their promises, and to make our basic need for an equitable, sustainable, and secure future heard is our birthright. We who grew up in the era of social media have a platform to speak up. And in a few years' time, without even needing to wait to enter the workforce, we can make our opinions known by voting and empowering the voices for change and climate justice. Because governments need to fulfill their duty to protect their citizens. And right now, we need them more than ever. Thank you.